thinking of different ways of thinking about society in terms of practice, there's the rise of monasticism. It's not clear when the first person decided, I want to be a monk, who probably didn't say, I want to be a monk, but acted like that, right? Who's the first one? There seem to have been, and Gonzalez talks about this, there seem to have been some prior to Constantine, but it's after the time of Constantine that more people choose to leave society to live a monastic life. And that was part of what we talked about in culture and society. Those people that said, we've got to separate ourselves totally from culture. And they ultimately believed that Scripture encouraged a monastic life. Now, how you would interpret being in the world but not of the world, maybe they would say we're in the physical world, but we're not of the cultural world. Maybe that would be a way to approach it. But certainly we see quite a bit in Scripture emphasizing we have to engage the culture around us. Probably there were some elements here in the development of monasticism that came from classical philosophy and religion. The Stoics, emphasizing the control of passions, right? You have to control yourself. You have to control your body. The sacred virgins and priests of paganism might have been an influence here as well. Even during this time, you see a little bit of a push towards clerical celibacy, meaning that priests, bishops, religious leaders should not be married, should not engage in sexual activity. That comes much more fully in the Middle Ages, but there's some of that push now. But monastics said, we're going to vow to be celibate, we're going to take vows of poverty. The term monk or monastic comes from a Greek word meaning solitary. The first monks appear to go to the Egyptian deserts to escape what they called the noise and distraction of society. The lifestyle of those monks, as you might guess, was very, very simple. You engage in certain crafts and you trade them for food. Your time is spent praying, memorizing Scripture. You have basic possessions. You have a very simple diet. You're eating bread, you're eating fruit. What's the point of doing that? Why would somebody choose that life? Discipline, but for what end? What's the goal in doing that? Holiness. Right? And so the idea is I need to, and in some sense we would probably say the idea makes sense of kind of separating from other people to discipline yourself to focus on something godly or something holy, but not for an entire life, right? As some of these people did. Most of the early monks were anchorite monks. Anchorite meant that they were solitary monks. They would live by themselves or with just a few companions. People like Paul the Hermit and Anthony are some of the earliest we know of that had this kind of anchorite, took this anchorite, which of course, if they're living by themselves, how do we know about them? Well, they didn't totally, for the rest of their lives, separate, right? People would interact with them and those kind of things. But by the beginning of the 3rd century, we begin to find Cenobitic monks, or communal monks. One of the first major ones who kind of organized a monastic community was a man named Pachomius. To be a part of that monastic community was to engage in very strict rules and discipline. And eventually it worked up to you being on a 3-year probation before you were fully accepted into the community. And so for 3 years you gotta stay doing the right thing. A lot of the emphasis was on work and devotion, times of common prayer, meditation. There was even a hierarchy of superiors, right, where there were people that were above you in the community that you had to listen to and obey. Even children, evidently, were omitted by Pachomius. One of the things that was emphasized was the ability to read. Remember, in the ancient world, there wasn't high rates of literacy, but you had to learn to read so you can memorize Scripture. The community had rules of silence, where there should be no sound, no talking at certain points of the day. You had 2 meals a day. And then those meals consisted of bread, cheese, herbs, olives, fruit, but no wine and no meat. Unless you were in the infirmary, right? Unless you were sick. And then in order to get back to health, you would eat some meat. You might have some meat. But it was a community of this constant surveillance and supervision, right? If you stepped out of line, you would be disciplined or punished. If you laughed during prayer times or arrived late for something, you might have to kind of stand off by yourself, or you might be publicly shamed in the community. And so monasticism starts developing, again, a lot of this early monasticism is in the eastern part of the empire. Egypt, places like Syria, Palestine, Mount Sinai. It seems like sometimes some of these monks became, especially in Syria, became very, very severe in their discipline. Gregory of Nazianzus, one of the Cappadocians, spoke and wrote about monks who fasted for long periods of time, like 20 days, wore fetters or chains, stood praying in the rain and the wind and the snow. When I hear things like that, I'm saying, I'm okay praying in air conditioning. I think I can still be holy. But yeah, this is how devoted some people were. That thinking that somehow by doing these things, they would be more holy. And while certainly that discipline of separation can bring about better focus, some of these other things might seem like extremes. As I mentioned, Gregory of Nazianzus was one of the Cappadocians, and the Cappadocians are one of the early, out of the Cappadocians we sent some of the early monastic rules, especially Basil of Caesarea, based on the encouragement from his sister Macrina that we talked about earlier. Ultimately, the Basil's rules tried to avoid these extremes, the extreme fasting, extreme praying, extreme discipline. And so, trying to develop a community where the monks could love God but also love their neighbors, which also makes monasticism a little bit more practical, a little bit safer, right, than going out by yourself. How do you get food? How do you get clothing? You have to kind of depend on yourself. But in community, you can divide up the work, right? Somebody's planting, somebody's creating other types of crafts. Children were encouraged to enter the monastic life, but married people and slaves were also accepted. Ultimately, Basil's community emphasized the monks need to provide services to the needy, right? And so it wasn't just about you going off by yourself, but you should also use that time to reach out and serve those less fortunate than you. And so monasticism, through Basil's work, becomes more something that's a part of the larger mission of the church and not just something separate that an individual does by themselves. Monasticism also offered an opportunity for women to take a role of leadership and service in the church as well. And so there are several women monastics that are rather prominent from this time period. We've already mentioned several times, of course, Macrina, Basil of Caesarea, and Gregory of Nyssus. sister, and she really emphasized this idea of contemplation and renunciation to her brothers, who then were able to mainstream into a larger church, developed a monastic retreat on their family's holdings. The family had quite a bit of land, and so she develops a monastic retreat there. Other famous women monastics at the time include Paula and Eustochium. They were companions of Jerome, the Latin translator of Scripture. They started monastic houses in Bethlehem, along with other things. Now, mostly we've been talking about Eastern monasticism. Western monasticism takes off a little bit later, but even in the West, there were prominent women like Marcella, who was a widow who had started a monastic community that included Paula and Eustochium. And then once Jerome kind of connects with them, they kind of follow him. One of the things she emphasized in this community was the deep study of Scripture. And it's not just enough to pray or to memorize Scripture, we deeply study it. Melania was another woman in the West, emphasizing monasticism. She was from a rich, aristocratic family, but at the age of 22 decided to become a monastic. She very, very strongly defended the Nicene theology, the Nicene Creed. And she followed monks into Palestine, and there started a double monastery on the Mount of Olives, one for men and one for women. Now, certainly monasticism will become a much greater phenomenon as we move into the Middle Ages. We're just seeing the beginnings of it. Communities will develop and will grow larger. And will be important for various moments of revival for Christianity. But before we leave monasticism, let me ask you this. Even though most of us come from Protestant backgrounds, we come from churches of Christ, monasticism not a part of our history, not a part of, it's not encouraged certainly. We don't find a pattern in Scripture of that. But, again, putting ourselves in the shoes of people in the 4th century, do you think you could have lived your life as a monastic? As a monk or a nun? You couldn't?
I could.
Yeah, there are moments in life where I would like it.
Right.
I think it would have been done what my life outside of Texas was like. I mean, I was poor, had very little. If there wasn't anything positive outside of him, it would probably be a nice retreat.
Yeah, I think we could probably think of reasons that it might be appealing to someone. And maybe the poor or socially marginalized, that might be a place where you could find a way to fit in with other people, right? Or have a community, have a family that you might not have had on the outside.
Yeah, it was like they were studying the Scriptures, and it wasn't just, we're just going to sit silent for forever and pray. But to memorize that would drive me crazy. But if we were talking amongst each other and encouraging each other, then I could see that.
One of the things that's interesting is that I've heard of members of the church, and I've heard of other people who don't have monastic traditions, who will sometimes go on these monastic retreats where you can go to, there's still monastic communities around, even in the United States, and where you can go for like a weekend or a week or whatever and participate in the life of this monastic community. And someone go to these places that have vows of silence. And all you get to do is, for hours on end, is sit in your room. And you have your Bible. And that's it. And they say that first day drives you crazy. And now again, I'm not speaking from experience, but just the idea, and then when you do have mealtime, still at mealtime, there's not much talking, right? There might be a little talking, but most of it, is meant to be about the passage you read today in your devotional time. Right? But by the second day, the third day, right, people say, well, there's a great spiritual benefit by the second or third day, but it's that getting into it part that a lot of people say is kind of, that's the difficulty, getting that over that hurdle of not having that. Ultimately, while I've had those moments, and I'm an introvert by nature, so I don't associate with large crowds and that kind of stuff, and so I do like to have my space. Sometimes need that alone time. I don't think I could adopt a lifestyle like that. But I understand why people would have thought, I really want to devote my life to God and to service, and to stay in the world would lead me to, right? And this kind of self-reflection of if I like Melania, who's a rich aristocrat, right? If I stay in my family's position, I'm going to fall into the traps of love of riches, love of power, love of esteem of people, right? And so, I have that temptation in myself, and so I'm going to avoid that by, renouncing that. And so I can understand that. Again, I don't think that it's necessarily a pattern for us as Christians, but I could see the appeal, and that some moments of that might be profitable spiritually, right? Of taking that time to really kind of focus on our relationship with God. Any other comments or any place we need to clarify about monasticism?
I have a semi-odd question. Did the male monastic communities ever interact with female monastic communities?
It doesn't seem like there was a lot of interaction. There was quite a split simply because of you're taking vows of celibacy, and so you don't want that temptation. And so you might find some communities, more common in the Middle Ages, where there are men and women there, but usually there's a lot of separation. Right? You're kind of in the same compound, but you're separated in quite a bit of ways as well.
That's like a lot of money situation.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that we have to realize as well is we're talking about. Ancient Rome was a hypersexualized culture, but it wasn't to the extent of what we have today. So, but yeah, there still would have been that temptation if there would have been interactions like that, which probably did happen.
Create a monastery made up of married couples.
Yeah, a couple monastery made up of married couples.